So first of all, I've been on. It's truly an honor to invite you on my podcast, and I really love your work on nomad's writing and the posts you post on Instagram. So first of all, can you introduce yourself a little bit about where you come from and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, certainly. So, firstly, I want to say thank you for having me on. Like I've seen you've had some great guests before on your podcast. So, really kind of honored and privileged to be invited to speak with you as well. Um, so yeah, so name's David Maris. I grew up in the UK, just about 40 miles north of London. And I guess like I was involved in track and field from probably like my mid-teens, my mid to late teens. And then being in Milton Keynes, um, that really kind of set me probably on the path that I took. So I was quite fortunate to grow up around the time and train at Milton Keynes Athletics Club when there were two really promising junior athletes. So firstly, a guy named Craig Pickering, who became an Olympic 100-meter sprinter in Beijing 2008. He also made the British bobsleigh team for the 2014 Olympics, but unfortunately had to withdraw with a back injury. Um, so spent a lot of time with him, seeing what he did, and that really sort of like piqued my interest in terms of, watching him progress and the type of training that he was doing. And then at the same time, there was another guy called Greg Rutherford, who was the Olympic long jump champion in 2012. Um, and again, just seeing his approach, seeing what he was doing with his training, it really kind of like triggered my interest. And I think what was really interesting between those two guys is they were very sort of like polarized in their attitudes. Like Greg was very sort of like laid back and sort of, I don't want to, I'm trying not to say this like in a negative way, but sort of like did the bare minimum. He was very much like you sort of like needed to push him to train a bit more, whereas Craig was completely the opposite. He required being held back. Like Craig would always want to do sort of too much and was very sort of like diligent in his approach. And it's probably a bit unfortunate, really. He almost had like too good of an attitude, too good of a work ethic. So anyway, that sort of like started me with my interest in track and field. I moved to Dubai in 2013 and I coached in Dubai for 4 years. So 2014 to 2018, I was coaching in Dubai. But I found that sort of like quite a sort of frustrating place to do so because I think like that there just wasn't a performance sport culture there. There was quite a big fitness culture and sort of like mass participation for kids and stuff, but it was very sort of disorganized, and I just don't think it was a very good place in terms of sort of like trying to develop a performance sport ethos. In 2018, we moved to the States. So meanwhile, kind of while all this was going on as well, I was a teacher as well. So I moved to the States and continued teaching for a couple of years in Massachusetts before moving down to Texas, where I am now. And I got my first collegiate coaching position in Texas. So I'm currently an assistant track and field coach at University of St. Thomas, which is a Division III school in Houston. Um, and there I work with the short sprinters and some of the jumpers, which yeah, I'm really enjoying. So that's sort of like my journey so far in a nutshell.
Cool. Did you enjoy coaching college so far?
Yeah, I love it. I think that so I think one of the things that I found challenging in Dubai is that like the sessions were very much operated on like a standalone basis. So you'd have somebody that would come, that they might come and see you for one session, then they'd work with another coach at different other times throughout the week. And so it was very difficult to, and I don't know whether this is sort of my issue in terms of being a bit of a control freak or not, but it was very difficult to, I always think that training needs to be planned in kind of like a schematic fashion. So what you've done the day before matters and what you're doing the day after matters. And so like having standalone sessions was quite difficult. And if I'm not planning the rest of the sessions, then it was difficult to know kind of where I fit. So in this collegiate environment, then I've got I don't know if control is maybe too strong a word, but I manage the entire program for my athletes. So therefore, theoretically at least, I know what they've done the day before. I know what they're going to do the day after, so I can plan today's workout with those 2 points in mind. So yeah, really enjoying it, and also just like the relationships that you build with the athletes. I think that because I'm seeing them more regularly, then I build a bit of a tighter bond with them, and as well because of the age they are as well. Then it's a bit more sort of like adult to adult conversation. Whereas, you know, in Dubai, a lot of it was with, or some of it at least was with younger kids. And so it wasn't quite so, I guess sort of like equal in those terms of relationship. It was very much, it was a little bit more like a teacher student relationship, whereas now it's a little bit more on level, I suppose.
Great, great. Good to hear that. So, um, the first question I want to ask is like when training like no matter uh track athletes or like team sport athlete, acceleration matters.
Mm-hmm.
They have like in team sport athlete, especially in football or like basketball, there's probably like 10 yards or like 10 meter to like accelerate.
Mm-hmm.
So uh for you and your thoughts, how would you like develop a an athlete's like acceleration?
Yeah, so I think that like one of the things, and maybe this comes a little bit from my teaching background as well. I quite like sort of like a constraint-based environment. So, for example, what we did with my athletes at the beginning of this season is Houston's very flat, so we have like a lack of hills, and getting loads of sleds. You know, at the time in the group, I think there were somewhere between 15 and 20 athletes. So getting 15 and 20 sleds wasn't sort of within our budget. Logistically, it just wasn't viable. But we have like a parking garage. So I think it's five or six floors or whatever. So we literally went up to the top floor, and then obviously there's a ramp that connects those floors. And I guess like we're lucky that we train in the morning. So like early, we were training at like 6:30, 7 a.m. So the garage is pretty empty. And then just took them onto the top ramp and measured out about 30 meters. And we kind of used that. So we kind of got our resisted sprinting through running up an incline. Um, and we did that I think we did that for about a 4 week block. So every Monday we do that for the first 4 weeks and sort of introduce them to acceleration on there. And to be honest, I felt like that didn't require like too much in terms of queuing from me, because the constraint being the incline required that they needed to push. Otherwise they're not going to go forward. And it, rather than having to think about, I don't like the queue stay low, because I think it's a bit of a, for various reasons. I think for example, like one reason might be it causes like breaking at the hips and bent over at the waist. But it meant that I didn't really need to talk too much about that concept, because the angle of the ground. So essentially, rather than bringing the angle of the body down to the ground, you can now, if you're on a ramp, or on an incline, you bring the angle of the ground up towards the body. So you're still getting like a slightly more acute angle between the body and the ground. So we did quite a bit of that. I think and as I say, it was, it was on in a concrete incline, but I think it was worth noting there that due to the volume, so we might do as a maximum like 15 runs over 30 meters up the incline. And there, so 15 times 30, what's that? 450 meters of volume. Because the volume isn't supremely high, and also I feel like because we're running up an incline, then the surface didn't necessarily matter too much in terms of the fact that it's concrete, and like impact and sort of issues with shins or ankles. We didn't really have any of that. And I guess sort of like have a bit of a theory in mind with that, in terms that because you're running up an incline, then with each step, the distance potentially between between like where the foot is at the top of the cycle and the ground where you're striking down to is slightly decreased, and so therefore there's less distance for you to accelerate the foot down towards the ground, which would mean that there's, you know, like slightly the foot is striking at a slightly lower velocity, and you know, maybe that like means that there's slightly less impact and slightly less potential for sort of injury and issues like that. But yeah, so I mean, we did that for a while, and as I say, kind of logistics meant that we didn't have to like worry about like everybody sharing sleds, changing the weights on the sled, all that kind of stuff. You know, we're not a school that has a budget for things like a 1080 sprint or anything like that. So did that for a few weeks, and I probably next season I will probably do it for a little bit longer. As I think we did it for a 4 week cycle, and I'll probably do that for 8 weeks next time, before transferring onto the track or onto the turf, onto a flat surface essentially, and then sort of like trying to, like apply the feelings that they've developed on the incline and doing that on the flat.
Cool. So you mentioned that this year you used like 4 weeks block
Yeah.
to do the like hill sprint,
Hmm.
and next year probably gonna do like 8 week block. So
Hmm.
why is that there's a shift from 4 week block to 8 week block?
I think like part of it is I think it worked well. And I think the other thing that I think just from like an athlete enjoyment perspective, I think the athletes enjoyed it. And so because they're running up an incline, then I think like intensity is naturally what's the word that I'm trying to say? It is sort of inhibited. So it's basically taken care of. Like the intensities aren't going to be too high because it's up an incline. So I was very comfortable getting five of my fastest guys out there, all getting competitive and racing up the incline. And I think like, we're talking sort of like 18 to 21-year-old males so there's quite a lot of sort of testosterone at that age, and that they're obviously all athletes. And so that they like the competitive aspect of that. And and them doing it up the incline means I don't really need to, I didn't feel too much of a concern for injury. Um, Whereas I don't know that I would necessarily feel as comfortable them doing that on the flat so early on. I think that especially with those kind of volumes, I think that a combination of the volume and the intensity might kind of lead me into, some kind of injury risk. And so yeah, that's pretty much the main reason. And yeah, and as going back as well, they enjoy it. So if they buy in and they're like, okay, they're excited for the Monday hill workout, then I think that's a big deal as well.
Love it, love it. So besides like hill sprint, do you think that is there like any other like element of like strength development is like that's gonna help like athlete develop their acceleration?
Um, yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a hot topic, isn't it, really? And I think that I don't want to say that I'm anti-lifting, but I think that the role of lifting, I think it's easy to overemphasize it. So I think for sure you probably need like a baseline level of strength, and if that isn't there, then increasing that baseline level of strength is probably going to help. Um, I also think that having the sort of like max strength qualities are probably going to influence at best maybe the first 5 meters or so. So if you're a field sport athlete, right? So if you're playing American football or soccer, and like you say, most of the runs take 5 to 10 yards, then that's great. That's a big deal, right? So you want to be capitalizing on that. As a sprinter that's maybe running 100 meters or 200 meters, then 5 meters is somewhere like 2.5 or 5% of the entire race. So investing a lot of effort in that potentially, and I think it's really worth noting that we have like limited resources in terms of time, in terms of recovery. And so if we're investing a lot of time developing max strength to really kind of work on that first 2.5% of the race, is that the best use of our resources, or are we better off investing them somewhere that may pay more dividends over the last 97.5% of the race?
Cool. Uh so is there like certain like benchmark when it comes to like strength training, and like how much is like too much? I know this is a I put you in a hard position to answer this.
No, that's fine. So in my current situation, I've never got to the point where I've thought, right, I really need to drive these athlete strength numbers up. I've not had that. And if anything, my athletes, and some of them do, like particularly the guys, they get frustrated because they feel we don't lift enough. So it's been a case of sort of like holding us back. So I've this season I've not done any max strength testing. I've not done any of that. I literally kind of use I guess like an RPE type approach. It's not as formal as that, but I tell them like if we're doing a set of, occasionally we might go up to 8 reps or 5 reps more typically. It's like the fifth rep should be a challenge. and that's kind of like how and that's how we're doing it. And then I'll see what I'm seeing, and like if it's if every rep is like really sort of like grinding a struggle, then I might say, look, let's take £10 off, £20 off, or whatever. And then on the flip side, if it looks really really easy, then I'll say, okay, I think you can go. I think you can go up £20 on the next set. But I think that the culture that I'm coaching in, where it's very much like a more is better. I think that's kind of the mindset that they have. More work is better. The harder you work, the better you're going to get. Like every workout should be that you're on your back vomiting. That's the kind of mindset they're in. Add into the fact that football, American football, is so popular here in the NFL and the college football, and they see these Instagram videos of whatever football superstar squatting 600 pounds or 300 kilos or whatever, and that their influence that they want to do that. So I don't think that I really need to worry about driving those, particularly with the men. I don't really need to drive that number up. Like it's a case of that I sort of have to moderate it and I have to kind of bring it back down. So yeah, I've not really looked into where I think the strength numbers need to be in terms of like, ratios to body weight. I tend to think that most of the in my setting as a track and field sprint coach, like my focus is going to be on the track. And honestly, if I had an athlete that came and said to me they don't want to lift, I don't think I'd have too much of a problem with that. We do jump training, so we do like real basic stuff, but we do like box jumps and we might do like depth jumps, we might do little kind of ankle pops, all that kind of stuff. And I feel like this hurdle jumps, I think that this kind of carries, I just think it's more transferable to, I don't necessarily have too much of a scientific rationale for it, but I think that, it transfers to sprinting better, probably somewhere in the time of like, the ground contact times are more similar, and like rate of force development then becomes a little bit more similar. You don't have, if you're struggling with a squat, that might take you 5 seconds to get the weight up. But when we're sprinting, we've got around a tenth of a second to apply force within the ground. So like how transferable is that? I don't know.
Yeah, I love this. So going back to like you mentioned that you didn't do any like max strength tests this year. So uh why didn't do any like max strength tests at the first place?
I think max strength testing is, I just don't like it because I think form gets compromised. And I think when you're doing things like squats or deadlifts or cleans, going for max with compromised form, the analogy that I make is that it's like when you see a car wreck, you see like a car crash and you sort of like drive past it and you don't really want to look because it's horrific, but you're sort of looking, and some of the form and the mechanics that I see when I've seen athletes try and do max strength testing, and I'm watching it waiting for something bad to happen because I'm like looking, and it may not happen right away, but I think that, and a lot of this is my own sort of like personal anecdotal feeling on it, is that, I don't think I had terrible form when I was lifting. It probably wasn't the best, but I don't think it was terrible. And like my back, it isn't great. I'm 40 years old. I'm not like, I like to think I'm not an old man, but I'm not the oldest man. I'm not like what most people would describe as old. Yeah, I'm middle aged, and my back's not great. And I think that a lot of that comes down to, me probably lifting too heavy in the deadlift, in the clean, and trying to squat. And so I think that like compounding issues that may have impacts on their quality of life later, that plays into it, and that's my own personal bias. And kind of because of my thoughts on how transferable it is, I just don't know if it's worth taking that risk. So yeah, I just
Totally agree with that.
yeah, I just don't think they need to be motivated to be stronger
Yeah.
in my setting. I don't think they need that. They love the idea of being as strong as they can, and they, the guys in particular will sort of like push the weight up. So if I'm saying, okay, right, let's see how much we can do, then I think I'm sort of adding another risk to that. I'm sort of like compounding the risk there by doing that.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Like uh although we're in like different situation and I'm not training like track athletes, last year when I get to train like a high school rugby team and a high school soccer team. I didn't really want to like do any like max strength tests
Hmm.
if the coaches didn't ask it.
Right.
However, at the end of the day, I still did it because the coach asked me to do it. They
Hmm.
want to know that if they're strong enough. But from my standpoint, I just don't think that uh how or how heavy we lift in the weight room transfer that much to their on-field performance. Even when it comes to like sports like rugby or like American football, that's like that much of a collision. I still don't think that we should like let our like athlete just like lift that much.
Yeah.
However, I do did a lot of like pull-ups, weighted pull-ups, that kind of stuff to help them get stronger on the upper body. But when it comes to like speed development or like power, I more tend to use like plyo or like
Hmm.
just sprinting or like resist sprinting. So I totally agree with your thoughts over there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. So in terms of, I don't think how strong you are in the weight room is necessarily a very good performance indicator in terms of how fast you're going to sprint. And, you know, a good friend of mine, he took, I can't remember what he started off with his clean out, but it was in the 120, it was like 120, 125 kilos, around that ballpark. And when he was cleaning that, he'd run the 100 meters in 10.2. And he took his power clean up to 155 kilos. And I don't think he could break 10.4. So he's made a significant improvement in his max strength, um, on what arguably is a more transferable lift than a back squat, for example, because the power clean is time phase, right? You've got like you can't do a power clean particularly slow because otherwise the bar doesn't come up. But yet he was slower. So if it was that important and he's made that significant an improvement upon his clean, then I think we would have seen some kind of positive transfer in his sprint performance as well. And I think I'm really lucky that I've got like a good degree of autonomy within my program. So, and and I can imagine it becomes challenging as a strength coach as well, because you've got to, as a strength coach, you've got to like demonstrate your value and demonstrate your worth. And I think it's quite difficult to it's quite difficult to do that. And one of the ways that you can do that is by saying, okay, well, this athlete's stronger now. And you know, whether that transfers or not is an entirely different question. So um, yeah, it's a tough setting because the team, you know, the team might perform better, but it's very difficult to attribute that and say, okay, well, we've won more games. That's because of the strength coach. So yeah, I don't envy you in that situation.
Totally agree with you. So next thing I want to discuss is like uh you wrote an article and mentioned that not all like sprints should be like max intent.
Mhm.
So why do you think that since it's sprinter and we try to like get them fast as they can,
Mhm.
why do you think that we shouldn't train them or like we shouldn't let them like sprint max intent every single time?
So I think that sprinting with max intent is a very taxing. It's a very taxing activity. So if you want to sprint with max intent, then I'm like realistically, how many reps you're going to be able to get in a session of them doing that. So you're going to need to keep the distance pretty short. So we're talking, I don't know, 40, 50 meters probably for most. And you could maybe get three, possibly four reps, maybe even less than three, maybe two, you know, 2 to 4 reps probably. So I don't think you can get, I think it's quite difficult to get a lot of exposure to that. And how long it takes them to sort of recover and bounce back before they can hit those hit those same times. I think in order to create the intent, you need to have some kind of competitive scenario set up. So whether you're racing against somebody else, you've got timing gates out or something like that. And you know, whether they're able to come back 2 days later and hit the same times again, that they might not be. Um, but then I also think kind of like long-term sustainability, like how often can you come out and redline, you know, every couple of days before something bad happens again. So I think like one of the things that it's definitely worth noting is that I'm quite cautious in my programming to the point that my athletes get again frustrated with it. You know, they see other training groups doing more work and they're like, oh, I feel like we should be working harder, we should be working more. But my injury rates are like they're not perfect, but they're not bad either. They're not bad. And that's always in the back of my mind in terms of, well, if you get injured, then you're no good to firstly, you're not going to be happy because you're not able to compete, you're not able to practice, you're not able to train. And then secondly, you're no good to the team because you're hurt, so you can't compete anyway. So I always want to make sure that I'm keeping them healthy. So that kind of plays into it. So like how many sessions can we do where we're really going with max intent before problems arise? And going sub max. So and I'm not talking about like, 80% intensity or anything like that. I'm talking sort of, in the 95% sort of window. So, 95%, if we're talking, that's half a second off their, well, if you've got a 10 flat guy, that's half a second off their 100-meter time. So a 10 flat guy running 10.5 should be relatively comfortable. And even more so once you start bringing the distance down, and then there's kind of less of a metabolic impact from that session. So I think it gives us the opportunity to do more reps. And doing more reps means that we have more exposure to the skill aspects. So the motor learning becomes more effective. So now, as opposed to doing 3 runs, we're now able to do, 8 runs. And so we can practice the movement better, which gives us a better learning effect from that. And I also think it was Hakan Anderson who said, he made a comment, and I think if it's right in the article that you're talking about, where he said like dare to race at 98%. And so I think going max with max intent and max intensity, I don't always think are necessarily the same thing. So there's a point where the harder you try, the slower you're going to go. And so I think that holding back a little bit allows for better mechanics. I think it allows for better rhythm, better smoothness, and all that kind of stuff. Things that are in it, like that are maybe less tangible and harder to measure, but can also very valid in terms of athlete development. They're important skills. And so like going sub max, I think allows for us to develop those as well. And because you can do more runs, then you get more development of them. So hopefully you end up with like better technique and stuff, a better mechanical process. But what I would say is, and you sort of did allude to this in the question, like at times we are going to go max, right? We are going to go as fast as we can. But I think I'm just very careful with how often I would dose that. And we've had a couple of relay practices this week. And this week's going to be quite a challenging. I think this is a challenging week for us because we've got a competition on Saturday. We did maybe 3 to 4 relay exchanges on Monday, and again 3 to 4 relay exchanges on Wednesday, which was probably more than I wanted to do, but I wanted to make sure the handoffs, the actual passes were taking place. But with those relay exchanges, for example, the reason I brought that up is because I think they need to be done with maximum intensity. Because otherwise things like the check marks, and you're trying to have like a collaborative process where you've got 2 athletes merging in the right position to exchange the baton. And if we practice that at sub max speed, then the whole kind of configuration of the change is impacted. So that would be an example of where we need to go, with max intensity, as close to max intensity as possible. And I think obviously it's good to have the athletes sort of exposed to that challenge before they get in the competition environment. I'm just very cautious about how often I would do it.
Nice. Love it. I love that you mentioned that max intent doesn't really mean maximal intensity.
Yeah, I don't think they're synonymous. No, not necessarily.
Yeah, and I think this is especially when we want to train like speed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that like the analogy that I use, and yeah, there might be some differences, but if I was teaching somebody the mechanics of a squat or a deadlift or a clean or a big compound movement in the gym, I wouldn't load them up with their 1 rep max and say, right, okay, I want you to think about this. And I just don't think it's the more you're thinking about the process in terms of you know, like the technical process, the motor learning aspects, then the intensity is going to go down. So that being said, if I want you to sprint as fast as you possibly can, then thoughts about mechanics are probably going to be put on the back burner. So if I want you to think about the skill of movement, the skill of sprinting, then you're probably going to have to compromise the intensity a little bit, or be willing to decrease the intensity a little bit in order to get that. And I think that's something that's really important. Ultimately, my perspective is that sprinting, that it's a skill, or there's a large skill component to it, and learning any skill with max intent, I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think you need to be willing to go, you know, back off the intensity in order to learn the movements correctly.
Cool, cool. So we talk about like max intent and a little bit about like uh how much volume you're gonna do when you train like hill sprint. What about
Mm-hmm.
like volume and intensity when it comes to like overall weekly layout, or like how much you're gonna let your athletes run
Yeah.
during the acceleration session, and how much you're gonna let them run on the, like, let's say max speed session.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good question, and I think like it varies according to time of year. So what I would say is at the moment we're in our season, so a lot of the maximal kind of speed, max intent work is taken care of by the meets themselves, and that might mean that they're running, you know, that they might run up to 400 meters that day, or 420 meters that day, really, in terms of actual, and then add on to that the warm up and the build ups that's going to add on, you know, that's going to add to that slightly. But if they're running 100 meters or 200 meters, and then potentially, you know, up to 130 meters of a 4x100 meter relay leg, then, you know, we've got 400 to 450 meters of volume there. On an acceleration session, as I said, like 450 meters, that would be the upper end. We might go way lower than that. You know, we could definitely, I mean, we might do five or six blocks to 30. So, you know, we're talking 150, 180, sort of maybe 200 meters of volume there as well. Um, in terms of max speed stuff, honestly, I mean, we haven't done a great deal of that this year, just because the way our calendar is sort of like formatted, it does bring its challenges with it. So the NC2A rules, they provide us with a maximum number of weeks that I'm allowed to be in contact with the athletes. So we have sort of like a fairly, well, I wouldn't call it prolonged, but we have like an off-season period, which takes us from September to the middle of November. Then I don't see the athletes from, so Thanksgiving, which is the fourth Thursday in November, so the beginning of that week, until the new year. So then they have about a 7 week period where I don't see them. And then I see them again at the start of January. But for example, I think I started seeing them on I can't remember what it was, like January the 4th or something like that. And then we had our first meet on January the 9th. So by the time we have that kind of like off-season chunk, and then we're straight away into competition period. So I don't have like a big sort of like opportunity to do what I would call like a specific kind of prep phase. So the max V work tends to get taken care of with the meets. But like from a theoretical example, then I mean, like I say, if we were going to go like all out, then I'd probably give them something like 3, maybe 4 runs over 60 meters. So again, what's that? 250. And then I'd feel comfortable going up to maybe 8 or 9 runs over 60 meters if I was saying, okay, we're going to hold this back to sort of 90%. So let's say if I've got an athlete that's capable of running 7 flat, and, you know, we had them running at sort of like 7.6, 7.7, 60 meter pace, then yeah, like going sort of like 8, maybe 9 runs. So, you know, I guess we're talking 500 meters or so, 550, 560. But you know, I wouldn't describe myself as a big volume guy anyway. I don't know if we've had any workout at all this year, even on the sort of the more kind of like general endurance runs. So like intensive tempo runs that kind of are going to bleed into our specific endurance work. I don't think we've had any athletes that have gone over 1,000 meters this winter. So a couple of them have gone up to 5 by 200, with 5 minutes rest, and that's sort of like a precursor for more specific works that comes later on. And those athletes as well will have done a workout of 3 by 300 meters. So that's 900 meters with, like a 6 to 10 minute sort of recovery period, depending on where we're at. And those are the guys that I've kind of classified my athletes into two groups. Those who I feel respond better to volume, and they would be the volume guys. The athletes that I feel like are a little bit more intensity driven, and that their mechanics and everything sort of like starts to break down if they do too much work. Instead of 5 200s, they'll do 5 150s. So that's 750 meters of volume. And instead of the 3 300s, they'll do 300, 200, 100. So that's 600 meters of volume. And all of that isn't to say, oh, like, look how little volume I do, because I think that I definitely think it's possible to do too little. But and I battle with my athletes on this, because they, it's kind of come out this week that a few of them, despite what I would consider pretty good performances, I think all but one of them have run a PR this season, and the girl that didn't run a PR was within 100th of a second of it and made some huge technical errors in that race. I think that, yes, so they've run well, but there's murmurs that they don't think we're training enough. So yeah, like it's kind of like a constant battle there. Trying to make sure that I'm giving them enough to kind of try and keep them happy, but also kind of keep them within the volumes that I think are appropriate, and keeping them safe. And yeah, sorry, I've rambled on a bit there.
Yeah, there's always a battle for coaches to like figure out which like how much is enough and how much is enough, and at the same time it's safe for our athletes to not overburn them.
Yeah. I mean, I had a conversation with Dan Paff about this quite recently, and he talks about ceilings and basements. So it's like, what's the upper limit that we can do for this type of workout where there's no kind of degradation to the performance, and then what's the minimum number, or what's the minimum volume we need to achieve in order to get the training effect that we're after, and to basically prevent that quality from declining, like on a over a long-term period. And I tend to consider myself, to be honest, like a fairly sort of like middle ground person. So you do get coaches that, I mean, I don't think they would touch 1,000 meters. They go, some that are extreme, sort of like on the way less than that. They're very kind of like anti-tempo running, and I don't think that's the case for me. But at the same time, I'm certainly not at the upper end where I'm like, every workout's going to be as tough as possible. So, you see coaches that are quite happy to give sort of like 10, 200, stuff like that, a couple of 1,000 meters of volume. That's not something that I'm interested in giving my athletes, or if it wouldn't feel comfortable doing so. But yeah, so I kind of like try to sit sort of like relatively middle ground, but trying to make sure I'm getting the qualities developed that I feel need to be developed.
Great, great. So the next question will be the last question of today, but it's also like a big question, big topic. So it's also on the article that you mentioned, that work back from injury. So can you like explain this? It does like what are the common injury you like deal with the most when it comes to like track
Yeah.
athletes, and how do you work back from it?
I think this is like I mean, this is a really loaded question. And, we are lucky enough that we have trainers in my current situation. So if somebody gets injured, whatever that may be, then I'll refer them to the trainer. And I don't want to say that I stay out of that process, but until the trainer sort of like says that they're happy for them to be back at the track working out, then I think that, like, there's a saying like, too many cooks spoil the broth. And so I don't want to be in there, kind of. I just think that it adds a layer of confusion if I stick my opinions in there when they're working with the trainer. Also, I'm not qualified in any medical field either, so I kind of like let them do their job. But I think that one of the things in particular that I've noticed, that athletes have come to me on day one. So, I've never coached them before. That this is day one of their collegiate career. They're coming in and saying that their shins hurt, and that kind of tells me that, okay, perhaps they're doing something, not necessarily, but my first thought is always going to be, I wonder how you were training in high school then. If you're 18 years old and you've got shin problems on the first day of training. Um, so in that scenario, like I tend to just be, like I modify the footwear, modify the surface, so I'll keep them in their flats. I won't have them running spikes, and I'll keep them on the turf as much as possible. And to be honest, I've had pretty good results of doing that. Like really, with the exception of block starts and relay exchanges, probably 95% of all their work is done on the turf, and they're capable of running personal best performances, running faster than they've ever run before. So I think that's been quite eye-opening or reassuring to me. That means, okay, do you know what? I don't need to panic now that I'm making sure that I'm getting them on the track in spikes in order to progress, because we've seen results where we've not done that. So I'll just try and like mirror the sessions as best as possible on the turf. So like speed development stuff, that's quite easy because instead of running 60 meters on the track, then they just run 60 meters or 60 yards on the turf, and it's very much sort of like for like. It becomes a little bit more challenging on the more general endurance repetitions, where like the athletes on the track might run 200 meters, for example. It's quite difficult for the athletes on the turf to run any further than 110 yards, unless maybe they run diagonally, but obviously like it's more challenging to get bends in and stuff like that. So like if the training group was running, let's say they're running, I don't know, 5 150s, so that's 750 meters of volume, then I might have the athletes on the turf do 7 or 8 by 100 yards, and I'll probably half the recovery or something like that. So if they're doing 5 150s off 5 minutes, then they might do 7 by 100 yards off 2.5 minutes recovery. And a lot of that is just like keeping logistics. So it means that I know that every other run, they're all going to run together. And it means that I don't have to have like several stopwatches where I'm trying to like time different recoveries, because I did try that and it was just too much. I couldn't keep up with it. Like people were missing reps. So yeah, kind of that in terms of the shin splints. Obviously, we get issues with hamstrings as well. And as I say, like I let in the first case, that they'll work with the trainer till they're at a point where they're comfortable coming back on the track. And I think like one of the, a couple of things that I keep in mind is that certainly moderating intensity, particularly on the longer runs. And I know that there is like a school of thought that you can accelerate fairly maximally over short distances when returning from a hamstring issue. It's not something that I've played around with too much. I think that maybe you can if mechanics are perfect, but I also think that if you've got somebody that might be, is so inclined to have the technical flaw where they strike out ahead of their hips on the first or second step, which I have seen happen. If your hamstring health isn't good, then I feel like that's a risk, right? You're compromising their ability to kind of work through the progression. So like I typically keep it as a that we raise the intensity. And the other thing that I do is like we have like the Dan Path dribble series, so where they dribble over the ankle, dribble over the calf, potentially dribble over the knee, and they can do like a reasonable amount of that work. And I think what I quite like with that is that obviously whilst like the force application isn't the same, like the frequency of movement, so like the stride rates, the cadence becomes fairly similar to sprinting, and they feel like they're having to sort of like move fairly aggressively in terms of like the arm switching like fairly aggressively, and then the feet are going up and down fairly aggressively as well. And so I feel like it gives them like at least some exposure to where they feel like they're, I guess, like the nervous system and sort of like that neural inhibition and all that kind of stuff is taking place at similar rates and it might do in sprinting.
Cool. Love this. So basically, that's all the question I have for today.
Okay.
So if there's like coaches and therapists are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Oh, that's a great question. So, do you know what? Let me just pull up my handles because my Twitter handle is just David Maris 958. So Maris for Maris 958, all one word. And then my Instagram handle, let me pull this one up for you as well, it's David dmaris.958. And then, feel free to, if anybody has any questions, I'm not sure if they will, but if they do, then they can email me at dmaris958@gmail.com. So yeah, like always happy to speak to anybody that not even has questions, but it's people that just sort of want to kind of chat about sprinting, chat shop, and yeah, more than happy to do so.
Love that. Appreciate it, man.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.